for having me come back a second time to give you some insight to my experience. As Maria mentioned, I worked for over 23 years as an asylum officer. I've interviewed well over 10,000 asylum applicants and made decisions on their claims. So what I'm going to do today is just go over two different areas. One are some cases, asylum cases that are likely to be granted that I felt are important to go over what types of cases are likely to be granted. And then the second area would be asylum cases that are likely to be either referred if they're not in status, or denied if they're in status. So I'm just going to go over several points. Before that, I know one of the major concerns, as everybody has, is the backlog. There's well over 430,000 cases in the asylum backlog that either have never been interviewed yet, cases going back to 2013, 7-8 years that have never had their first interview, and or cases that have been interviewed, say 4, 5, 6 years ago, but have never had a decision. And I know that's weighing on a lot of minds of a lot of people. Unfortunately, the situation is still very tenuous. It's still very difficult to say when these backlog cases are going to be either interviewed or be decided upon. I know there were some recent congressional actions that were done. I think about 40 congresspersons spoke up about this issue because it's a very major issue. And the USCIS Asylum Division is hiring, they made an announcement, over 140 new asylum officers to address the issue. But as far as when, when these interviews are going to take place, when they're going to be scheduled, I should say, or when the decisions are going to be rendered, is just very hard to say at this point in time. Hopefully soon. I would just recommend everybody to be optimistic, to be hopeful that you'll be getting either a scheduled interview soon or a decision. And there are ways to expedite these backlog cases if you would want to go into that in a future time. I would be happy to share with you some information. So as far as cases to be granted, so number one, the cases have to meet all the criteria of an asylum case. For example, the 1-year filing deadline, except there are exceptions to that for extraordinary circumstances or change circumstances, change conditions in the country. But the 1-year deadline is an important criteria. And if you don't meet the exceptions, then that is one way that your case would be referred. You have to meet a nexus, obviously. Your asylum case, whether you've been persecuted in the past or you fear persecution in the future, it has to be on one of the 5 grounds for asylum, which are race or religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. So it's very important that even if you have legitimate reasons for fleeing your country, it has to be based on one of those 5 nexus areas. And the case basically has to be a believable case. It has to make sense to the asylum officer according to the country conditions in the past and also in the current country conditions. In other words, if you're explaining situations that happened in the past that don't, that are not consistent with the country conditions at that particular time, then it's very likely then the case would not be granted, because there isn't a connection between what happened to you and what was happening in your particular country. Also, it's important that the applicant explained what happened in a very clear and concise way, as best as possible. Of course, it's a little nerve-wracking. It's very nerve-wracking to go into an interview like this. It's, you know, that's why hopefully if some of you are interested in these mock interviews that I'm doing, I'd be very happy to do that. But the asylum officer wants to hear direct answers to questions, and not to go into tangents or go into other areas, because they're going to prolong the interview and it's going to perhaps frustrate the asylum officer. So when the asylum officer is listening to your story, it's going to make sense. It's going to be very logical, and it's going to be very believable. So I would also not bring forth a tremendous amount of overall generalized country conditions information. The asylum office has access to State Department reports, to all sorts of reports from non-governmental organizations, human rights organizations. And so there's no need to bring in a tremendous amount of generally basic country conditions, unless you have information, a newspaper article, something like that, which mentions your name or your group, say you're a member of a small group specifically. I had an example, for example, I interviewed thousands of Venezuelan applicants, for example, and many of them participated in protests against the Venezuelan government of either Chavez or Maduro. And I remember one case, which I still remember to this day, which was very compelling, because the applicant was a young man. He participated in the demonstration like a lot of his fellow citizens, and a lot of the stories are very similar. In this story, however, which made it very compelling, is that he had a newspaper article, an original newspaper article with his name in it, saying that the authorities, the police shot at him. And it had his name, and his father was also involved in that demonstration. So that piece of information, I felt, was, and I still remember to this day, a very important piece of information, because it was specific to his case. Also, it's not necessarily essential that you bring in corroborating written information about your case. Many times I've seen police reports, I've seen hospital reports, but some of those reports are hard to verify. Are those legitimate or not? So unless you have, I would say 100% sure that the report that you have, whether it's a police report or a hospital report or any kind of government, say, sanction or government summons, unless you have 100% sure that that's a legitimate document, I would be suspect in bringing that in, because the asylum officers in the last few years have been focused a lot on fraud. And unfortunately, there is a lot of fraud in documentation fraud. And that can even be photos. Photos, for example, of demonstrations. Nowadays with the technology, you can put yourself in a particular photo and say, this is me at that demonstration. However, the US, excuse me, the USC, excuse me, I just had to skip the water. The USCIS fraud division, if they suspect that there is fraudulent documentation or that a photo may be superimposed or fraudulent, or they would take that, and your case could perhaps be on hold for a while, even years. The investigative tools are not always that great that the fraud department has in investigating whether a document is legitimate or not. However, there are investigative tools that the fraud officers can look at. And so I would just be very careful about presenting that type of documentation. I remember a case very vividly. I interviewed a Saudi Arabian woman who was she was a lesbian and also a feminist. And according to Saudi Arabian society, women feminists and lesbians are highly discriminated against. She didn't have any specific documentation that she brought to the table. However, the case was so compelling, the way she explained it, the way she explained her circumstances, what happened to her, that it really wasn't necessary to have any sort of documentation, because it was she explained it in a very concise, a very compelling way. Also, the timeline is very, very important. I remember interviewing a case. I thought it was an extremely compelling case of a young man from the former Soviet Union. And he had a lot of political issues. He was involved in politics. I thought it was a very, very strong case. And he even explained in detail what happened to him, even the arrest and torture and so forth. So I was very intent on granting that person asylum. However, when the case got reviewed furthermore, because there is further review after the initial interview, a supervisor on a granted case would look at that and have to approve it. The supervisor noticed that the same time when the applicant explained that he was arrested and he was imprisoned and even being tortured in the former Soviet Union, that same time frame, it was found out that he was living in Western Europe at the time, not in his home country. So, and that information, because of the access that the asylum office has about various systems, where people are, where they have traveled to, that was discovered. And so a case that I thought was going to be a relatively good grant turned out to be a referral, because you could not be in two places at one time. You cannot be living in Western Europe at the same time you're claiming to have been arrested and jailed in your home country in the former Soviet Union. So lastly, it's very important to clarify any and all inconsistencies and discrepancies. There are going to be some minor instances where there's some discrepancies and some inconsistencies, and that's fine. That's very, very normal. But if there's major discrepancies. If there's, for example, if you're claiming, harm that was done in 2005, and that was on your written statement, and then verbally you said it happened in 2010. That's a 5-year difference, which is a major discrepancy. And the asylum officer will ask you to clarify any discrepancy, whether it be a small discrepancy or a large discrepancy like that one. And you're given a chance to clarify. And if you are able to clarify, that's wonderful. That's great. Many people are. Because, the discrepancies are maybe small. But if there's some major inconsistencies and major discrepancies that cannot be clarified, that would be also a reason for a case likely not to be granted. Now, excuse me one minute. Now cases that are likely to be referred, besides what I mentioned earlier about the 1-year deadline cases, if there's no nexus to any of those 5 grounds, race or religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group, if there's no nexus, say somebody, and many people flee for legitimate reasons, because of economic reasons, because of crime, because the situation in their country is just chaotic. Those are legitimate reasons to flee. However, those are not legitimate reasons to be granted asylum. It has to be based on a nexus, as I explained before. And then if you're unable to be detailed enough, if you're too vague, or that's also an area where cases are likely to be referred because it's too generalized. It's something that could be picked up by, for example, reading a country condition and then sort of paraphrasing that. So you have to be specific to your claim, to your particular case. On the flip side of that, if sometimes cases I've seen, they have very, very specific dates in the past. And these dates in the past, say there could be 10 dates in the past. And many people remember years. They may remember months, but they may not remember the exact date when something happened. So sometimes, if you're too specific with dates, it may throw up a red flag to the asylum officer, maybe. That's just an area that you, and if it does, you would just say to the asylum officer, I'm very good at dates. I remember dates very well, and this is so important. These events happened to me, and they were so traumatic to me that I remember. So all that could be clarified. And obviously, if there's any sort of major culpability or involvement with a terrorist organization, or aiding and abetting a persecutor or a terrorist group, if you're somehow complicit or involved in helping any sorts of rogue groups that harm others, that would be a case which would likely be referred. Or if you committed a felony in the United States, or for example, misdemeanors are okay. There's not, many people commit small misdemeanors. But if there's felonies, for example, that you've been convicted of in the U.S., that would be also a good chance that you would be referred or denied. So I want to also just, one last point is that no matter what you present, whatever information you present, the events have to be consistent and concur with what was going on in that particular country at that particular time, past or present. It's important to establish a connection, to establish a linkage between what was going on in your particular country at that particular time, because as you know, country conditions do change. Countries can go through either positive changes. They can, for example, have a dictatorial, very difficult history, but then democratic rule comes into place, and vice versa, where you could have a more or less democratic country, for example, Venezuela, even though it was it wasn't necessarily the same type of democracy that we would have in the U.S., but it was viewed as a more or less of a democratic society, and then it turned to be very authoritarian, very dictatorial, and there are many, many countries around the world like that. So obviously, the information that you present has to concur with country-specific information.
Thank you so much, Alan, for giving these very good specific examples, and I'm sure there could be many more, but I think we have a lot of questions. So again, I think some people have put them in the chat to everybody, to Tsendalia,